Well, I'm Kevin Baer, and I'm the executive editor of Defense One. So thank you all for coming out this morning. I know it's hard to pull you away from the impeachment hearing proceedings that are gripping Washington. If you're a reporter like us, you have to watch hours and hours and hours. So I'm grateful for the break. Maybe, I don't know if you are too, but we get to talk about actual business and a fascinating topic, I think. We're called Defense One, so people naturally might assume we're pretty focused on just what DoD does and the military does, but we actually have quite extensive coverage across federal agencies and law enforcement and Homeland Security as well, and not just for wars overseas, but for what the government's doing and agencies are doing here at home, which is more what our topic is today. So an interesting panel. We've got the Coast Guard, we've got the FBI, and the Army, Army Corps of Engineers, all represented. There might be a good football game in there somewhere. And the topic is on how data is helping your agencies and how you're using data to prepare for crisis response, whether that's natural disasters like floods and hurricanes, or perhaps other threats that come in through DC, especially here from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So two of us spoke earlier about some of the priorities that we wanted to give you the chance to talk about, and also to help drive us to the future of what you want for your agencies, what you might need, or what you're excited about, specifically when it comes to using data. So we'll start, I think, we have to start with the ranking member to the far right, with the Vice Admiral.
That's you, buddy.
Also because I can't not say that I'm a proud grandson of a World War II Coast Guard vet, so there's a place in my heart. Yeah.
And we'll still take you.
Yeah. I thought I'm way too old, and the problem is he grew up in the Great Lakes of Michigan and signed up at Marinette, Wisconsin, where they make the LCS ship actually, and the Vice President was yesterday. But I grew up in Florida, so if you can assure that I'm in the warm water, we'll have a conversation.
American citizens in nice places deserve to get protected too. So.
Well, welcome, Admiral, and why don't you kick us off with the topic at hand? How you're the director of operations.
Yep.
So how you're using data these days to prepare, manage, whatever you need it for.
Right. Well, first of all, fundamentally during a crisis, the job of the Coast Guard remains the same. Protect man from the sea, protect the sea from man. That's still our job. Let's define that a little broadly, though, because in a crisis, you're doing all that on steroids, and it's moving quickly. So a couple things. First of all, is knowledge of the event, and I'm using those terms carefully. First of all, I'm using the term event. There is no such thing as an incident anymore around the world. With the 7x24 news cycle, what used to be a minor thing, whether it was not that any oil spill is minor, but a typical event or a minor storm, gets ramped up and has the nation's interest. So getting knowledge of that is critical. And you heard the colonel say that the enemy gets a vote. Those in peril get a vote on how that information comes in. And there's a varied way that you work with those partners. And the partner is certainly driven by the event. Good example, my time in Boston in command, Hurricane Sandy came. When you're working with New Jersey, New York, 1,400 vessel movements a day in the Port of New York and New Jersey, that's a whole different family and friends plan of who you need to connect with to find out what the situation is, what the shortfalls are, and what we need to roll in and do, than the Boston Marathon bombing that happened 6 months later. That was an event run by a private organization, the Boston Athletic Club, that had their command post to run a marathon that suddenly ramped up and became a crime scene investigation, a city lockdown, and folks all around the town that are securing the city, working with the FBI, who had lead on the actual criminal activity. So I would say whatever system you have has to feed on knowledge, and sometimes that knowledge is a human with eyes and ears that's listening and reporting back. It doesn't have to be data necessarily. Good example, Hurricane Sandy, you could not have picked a worse place for energy interruption. Pipelines go through there, refineries are there, and the ships actually deliver the product there. We found by having liaison officers at the 12 big facilities that would make the biggest impact to return the nation to normalcy was the best we had, because they could phone in and say, I'm seeing this or seeing that. And then finally, as far as those in peril get the vote, we would love everybody to call on a Marine Band radio and tell us you're in trouble, because we have a great network that does direction finding and it picks you up, it's recorded. More and more people are now communicating distress via cell phone.
They're tweeting to the Coast Guard.
They're tweeting to the Coast Guard.
I'm drowning.
So we've had to open up our command centers with social media during crisis, and also folks will call wherever they can find on social media. Our Coast Guard headquarters, which is a corporate headquarters, is one of the first numbers if you Google Coast Guard. We ended up standing up a command center there that was nowhere close to where the incident was, because that's where the calls were coming in. They were collecting the case data and then getting it to the folks who were actually running the event. So hope that gets you started on some thoughts for the
Well, it's an interesting perspective that people first, as military likes to say, before we get to data. Army Corps, we're going to jump to Army Corps because they work so much closer with the Coast Guard, as according to what we talked about earlier on our call. You said you've had a busy few years.
We have.
To put it mildly. Why don't you walk us through what some of those events were and what you've learned and where you're at today?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me today, and it's nice to be up here with these two colleagues. Corps of Engineers, we're involved in many things: military construction, water resources, research development, and environmental work. But we're also involved in contingency operations, both overseas in support of the warfighter. But more typically known by the public as our work, as we work with colleagues from Coast Guard and interagency federal partners to respond to natural hazards here in the United States. The last couple of years have been very resource intensive. 2018, 2019, we've had around 80 events. Some are still going on, as in a year and a half plus in terms of boots on the ground doing long-term recovery. We've had over about $10 billion of mission assignment dollars from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And we've had roughly 4,500, 5,000 of our employees, both military and civilians, who've deployed downrange. And you start talking about those events, the complexity, the duration, and that puts a tremendous drain on resources, funding, materiel, and even more importantly, we're finding our people, because the majority of those that we deploy in an event are volunteers who have normal day jobs. A small component of our people are full-time emergency management practitioners, if you will. So we rely heavily on data. I think a common operating picture where we all see and share situational awareness of exactly what's going on has been one of our most pressing initiatives. I just left, and in fact, I'm really glad to be here because I got to come home from Dallas last night. We're doing an enterprise-wide governance meeting, and yesterday our keynote speaker was a gentleman named Jack Dangermont from Esri. It's a geospatial and information services company, one of the nation's premier, if not one of the world's premier company. And Mr. Dangermont talked to us about data and the importance of it. And I think one of our previous speakers was speaking about what happened, but he also, Mr. Dangermont, focused on what's next. And so we are really working hard on getting a common operating picture in place across all our functional areas, but we've started in the contingency operations arena. We need real-time data and situational awareness so that we can make risk-informed decisions as leaders, as managers, so we can move resources ahead rather than be behind, and so that we can put our people in the right place at the right time.
Tell us, what does that mean, a common operating system?
It's how we're developing. It's a geospatial-based system. Data comes in from all various sources, but we're able to tap into that data. Applications are built that access and manipulate that data. In the contingency ops arena, it gives us real-time, for example, flood gauge data. We're monitoring how rivers are rising. We can do predictive modeling and access that through this portal to see where inundation is going to occur, where trafficability on routes might occur. We work closely with the Coast Guard on helping open ports and waterways immediately after a storm. So we can gather that kind of information real time and get to work faster.
And is this all just for Army Corps of Engineers' eyes to see, or across agencies and branches?
Well, we work closely with other agencies and branches. Right now, we're working so that our agency can more efficiently and effectively use our resources.
Amen.
But I think some of our earlier speakers have talked about the need, though, to not only have visibility and see yourself within your organization, but across the department. And I think in our case, with our interagency partners.
So then let's bring in the FBI, I think, because you, one of the things you said earlier to us that caught my ear was that the number of agencies that you might have to deal with. So tell the audience what your job is here, first of all.
So my job is I supervise the Joint Terrorism Task Force. There's 56 field offices in the United States as far as FBI offices. There are 56 Joint Terrorism Task Force. What that means is, you know, when you look at the media and you look at the way the FBI is portrayed on TV or on the news, is that typically, or in movies actually, is typically that the FBI works solely by themselves. We come in, we take over, and we get a lot done.
And all within a 1 hour episode.
All within a 1 hour episode, flying around on a jet plane. But that's so far from the truth. When it comes to it, we can't do this job by ourselves. There's 13,000 FBI agents worldwide. That's not nearly enough to do the mission that we do. New York City alone has 45,000 police officers. So our numbers are minuscule when it comes to the amount of responsibility we do have to take on. But with that said, we realized a long time ago that the key to success for us is interagency cooperation. So the Joint Terrorism Task Force is an environment where we co-locate our partners, whether it's military, local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, but all of our partners sit together, our systems are together, we share information real time, so we know what's going on, and we're not basically duplicating what took place years ago that led up to the failures of 9/11. So the challenges that we have is that we have a no-fail mission. We can't afford to miss anything really at this point. So part of that is understanding the levels of the threat as far as being able to detect, disrupt, and then dismantle the ongoing threats. So with that said, the challenge is the data and how do we get our systems to A, talk to each other, and for us to be able to utilize that. The challenge that we have is that we have both the unique and challenging position of being both a law enforcement agency as well as an intelligence agency. So with that data is coming in with those two hats in mind of, is it for intelligence purposes? Is this classified information that will never see the light of courthouse? Or is this information that we will need to be able to disclose to the public as far as the mechanisms and the sources that we took to receive that information? So that's an ongoing challenge for us to make sure that we're protecting our equities, but making sure that we disrupt the threat at the same time.
I think I wrote down you coordinate with 53 agencies?
Yeah, so the Washington Field Office is unique in the sense that we have the highest number of agencies represented. We have 53 agencies within Washington, D.C. And a quick example where that becomes interesting, let's say hypothetical situation, which typically happens every Friday. Individual decides to go to either the White House or the Washington Monument to either conduct an attack or make a threat. That individual, where they're standing, the FBI would have jurisdiction, Secret Service would have jurisdiction, Capitol Police, Metropolitan Police Department, depending on if it's a bomb or a weapon threat, ATF, or so you can see automatically there's at least 7 or 8 agencies that would have to respond and be responsible for that ongoing threat. So that's where the Joint Terrorism Task Force comes in, where we understand those layers of complexity and understand that when that incident happens every Friday, we're going to be able to take care of that.
Yeah, I think it was a Friday night long ago. I made a wrong turn and got on the Pentagon parking lot looking for 395, and I ran through a stop sign I didn't see, and 4 different law enforcement agencies pulled me over.
Absolutely.
4.
Sounds about right.
Luckily, I have a Pentagon pass in as a reporter, and they let me go. but that was just a stop sign. I can't imagine. Well, all 3, the common thread that I'm hearing is the need. Is this the need? Number one is awareness. Data gives you that. But people still matter to how you put it together. I mean, explain a little bit more than, I guess, what kind of data we're talking about. So are we talking about, like you said, it can range from flood levels to access to known terrorist threat, actual people, or is it managing your assets, managing ships, managing personnel? It just sounds enormous.
Yeah, let me key on Ray's comment about common operating picture. I mean, the goal would be it's agnostic to the source and what flavor it's in. If it plugs and play on my screen, great, I got a geodisplay. Yeah. If it doesn't, there's some gonculator that makes it in the right format that does show up on my geodisplay. So, as a hurricane arrives and folks are calling the Coast Guard, we were getting calls from Staten Island, not 911, to the Coast Guard, because 911 was overwhelmed. So we had geopins of the houses where people said, I'm in my house, I'm flooded, I need to get rescued. You continue on to, the port status as the event continues. And it's kind of interesting. One thing we've done recently, working with the Corps of Engineers, the big relief is going to come from the sea. I mean, you can only fly in so much stuff and truck in so much. When you've got a ship that can bring in 12,000 containers of commodities, relief supplies, all that, we've worked with the Corps. Pre-storm, we already work with the merchant mariners on what are the key buoys that you will need to get back in this port before those buoy tenders built in Marinette that you talked about can get out here and put the buoys out. What we've been doing the last 4 storms, we've put over 300 virtual buoys electronically out there. And the merchant mariner that comes in is watching on his moving map display, yep, there's a red buoy I'm used to seeing. It's not really there, it's on his screen and he's got what he needs. Does it meet the need of everybody? Absolutely not. Joe Boater that's just going out to fish, who usually isn't post-hurricane, doesn't see it. But the big guys that are coming in to get that $4.6 trillion of economic impact going again and getting the port reopened, getting the relief supplies, and something as simple as a boat that is washed up in the marsh. That's a hazmat site because it has fuel, it's got petroleum, it's got all that stuff. We use a NOAA database. The marine inspector or the helicopter pilot clicks a picture, geopins it, and all the information about that is captured on the geo display. They slap a decal on the side of the boat that's got a discrete number, so when you call the Coast Guard, you could say, I'm with the Miss Lou. Somebody put an orange decal that's got this number on it, and we go, yep, got a picture of your boat. What's your plan to clean that up and get your boat off that guy's front lawn? I mean, all that stuff is how you kludge the information together. Pre-storm, during the storm, rescue those in peril, reopen the port, and then how do you take care of all that hazmat stuff, the stuff that, working with the Corps is going to be a little bit of a longer. I mean, dewatering the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, 33 million gallons of what the longest tunnel in North America, both tunnels were full. And we worked with the Corps to dewater those because that was a critical artery for getting the city open again.
That's amazing. I mean, so do you have a wish list of needs that came out of some of these events?
More money would be nice.
And if you're listening, Congress.
It's tongue in cheek, of course, but the Coast Guard's in a unique spot that we're a branch of the armed service that is not in DOD. Yep. And recently I had a senator that we were talking about the Coast Guard, and that senator happened to have been governor at one point. And I said, what's the size of your state budget when you were governor? And that state had a budget bigger than the United States Coast Guard. 36 states of the Union have a budget bigger than the United States Coast Guard. An armed service that's buying warships, helicopters, C-130s, and responding to. So when we say we need money, and unfortunately, while DOD has grown about 12% in the last couple of years on operating funds, we've only grown about 3% because we're in DHS versus DOD.
And even subject to government shutdown drama.
Oh, we went 35 days without pay, which we don't plan to do that again. So number one would be money. Number two would be starting to realize that mobility and IT are enablers and necessary for our frontline operators. In my 36 years in the Coast Guard, computer basically was another IBM Selectric that allowed you to type some really nice memos. It has progressed to how we control and command forces, send information. It's the spinal cord of our service. We need to realize mobility, and the iPad, there's a picture, I put it on the iPad, it goes off the satellite, the command center sees it, I go to the next boat that's blown up on the shore. That's where we need to get, is everybody's a collector, everybody can capture that, everybody can blink it off a satellite. That's where we need to be.
I mean, in these days, data is as important as bullets, right? For some of the services. And
knowledge is power.
Is this something where you're willing to trade, or are you being asked to trade a cutter for a network?
Well, I mean, the service obviously makes a lot of trade-offs, but I would also say there's probably nothing as powerful as a white cutter sitting in the port that just got hit with a hurricane as well. Because everybody that responds, they got to eat, they got to sleep, they got to poop. Let's be honest, all that stuff needs to happen, and if they're on the beach in the impacted area, they're a burden to those cities that are trying to get resurrected. You put a ship out there, you've got satellite comms, you've got a helicopter, you've got unmanned aerial systems now that on some of our larger cutters. That's a great forward operating base, and guess what? It's all self-contained.
Well, if you had poop on your bingo card, you just won.
The loggies always say that. If you push somebody forward, you got to figure out they're going to sleep, eat, all that stuff.
So the same question to you two on your data needs going forward. I mean, it's more than just situational awareness, but give us a taste of some of the more recent lessons that have,
I think for us, it's beyond just the data. You have to look at, you have to take a step back. So it starts with the access. So access to the data. Where are we getting that data from? And that's where the human interaction comes to play, specifically for the FBI when it comes to prevention of terrorist activity or any type of criminal activity. So the access, having someone either physically present, in a place to be able to report it, identify, and then report on it. B is context, right? So having the data without context, you tend to ignore it, or there's a greater chance of you not being able to add the linkages that are necessary to then act on that particular data. And then beyond that, the analytics of the data plus the context plus the access to be able to paint a brighter picture to then act on that particular data and intelligence. So it really goes back to kind of a threefold approach of, having that human interaction piece involved at every level to then make sense of the data. The concern and the risk that everyone deals with is data in place where you have data, you have information, but no context. And so you're reacting to activities or events, terrorist events, after the fact, and going back and analyzing the data and seeing, with hindsight being 20/20.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was that the threats are changing now, faster than ever. Explain what you meant.
Yeah, so the threats are changing in the sense of gone are the days of individuals meeting in a back room, hashing out a plot and leaving behind evidence. These days, everyone has a cell phone, everyone has a laptop. People can literally be on opposite ends of the country or opposite ends of the world, planning and having to communicating with each other. So the challenge for us is encryption, peer-to-peer encryption, social media, everything that we take for granted as being convenient is also a challenge to law enforcement when it comes to being able to exploit that as well as use that. For us, our mission is very simple. It's to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution of the United States. Well, that Constitution does go both ways in the sense of it protects both the good guys and the bad guys when it comes to their privacy as well. So it's that balance of being able to leverage our current laws or have our current laws be updated to meet the ongoing changes in the technology. It is very difficult when it comes to a lot of the encrypted platforms that, frankly, some are designed to prevent law enforcement or intelligence agencies from being able to detect nefarious actors.
I mean, this is a big topic Defense One covers. My technology editor, Patrick Tucker, who couldn't be here today, he's actually down at Fort Bragg doing some special ops technology stuff. But we cover a lot as, like you said, it's there's both sides of the Constitution here, and this is a debate for the general public, not just for data professionals or security professionals in this room. Do you feel like you're on the right side or wrong side, or that the public gets your argument, or do you think you understand the kind of neutral position, and this is a debate for someone else to figure out?
I think it's a debate for someone else to figure out. I think with
I can imagine what side of the debate you hope wins.
Exactly, and I think it has to be a balance, right? At the end of the day.
Let me rephrase. Do you think tech companies are starting to get the argument that you're making to them, or are you beating your head against the wall trying to in an uphill battle?
No, I think we do. When we're talking about loss of life, a lot of these companies are taking the responsible approach and doing what's necessary to ensure that they're keeping our public safe as well. The challenge is, again, you have companies that aren't U.S. companies as well, so they don't have to abide by U.S. laws. So there is that challenge as well. And so when individuals tend to find these companies and shift over to those particular companies as well. So there is a challenge of the nimbleness and the speed at which companies and software evolves and technology evolves.
Director Alexander.
Well, first of all, with respect to data, I agree with everything that Lyonel stated here, and it's becoming an everyday topic. And one thing I have learned, though, the days, I think, of long-term software development and building standalone systems and silos, those need to change immediately. What we're finding is the millennials in our workforce, they will not wait. So they are developing their own tools and putting them to use. From the emergency management side, I think how we do business, it probably isn't going to change that much, but it's the technologies, the data that will enable us to be more efficient and effective. When we respond and then ultimately recover, our task by law is to restore damaged infrastructure to pre-storm conditions. Well, to know what pre-storm conditions is, we need the systems to allow us to have previously mapped and assessed what the condition of that coastline might be or the condition of that bridge. One of the big challenges we have, and this is the Homeland Security side of my portfolio, is we have over 700 dams in our infrastructure across the country, hundreds of locks as well. Every single one of them has outlived its design age. And we need systems that'll give us the data that let us know these systems are under stress, where these failures might be, how can we mitigate that risk. We touch on somewhat of what Lyonel just said. We look at our critical infrastructure, and we're very concerned for protecting it from bad actors who might, through cyber means, control our hydropower facilities, open gates, and release water downstream and inundate cities without any warning, or perhaps compromise our facilities explosively, what have you. For the water you're drinking here today, you talk about critical infrastructure, except for the bottled water perhaps, that water probably came from a Corps of Engineer facility, the Washington Aqueduct here in the district, where the water is stored, eventually processed, filtered, and goes out not only the district, but Northern Virginia and surrounding areas here in Maryland. So critical infrastructure is a big concern of ours. Additionally, we have hundreds of standalone facilities nationwide. And so I have an operations protection division, works closely with law enforcement in ensuring that the physical security, force protection, and even anti-terrorism posture for those facilities are in place. And so part of that is information sharing with other agencies, be it local, state, and federal, to allow us to be able to do that prudently.
I want to open it up to the questions in the audience. You have three experts here on with a lot of knowledge on planning and going forward. I'll maybe start off with a first question. And I mentioned this in our call. Your aide was on, Admiral. One of the stories that always seems to come up for me as a defense reporter when disaster strikes and the military is sent in is the ability of the military to get in right away at the beginning. But then the bit of lag time it takes, if it looks like this is going to be a long-term, longer event, to get more forces in. So the example that I mentioned earlier with them was when the Haiti earthquake struck, Air Force Special Operators can jump in or land in and reopen the runway right away. Mm-hmm. But it takes 5 days to get the Marine ship in. It takes 5 days or more to get the Comfort, the 1 or 2 hospital ships the Navy has to get in. And maybe should there be a larger capability, whether it's military or interagency, larger, to respond to those events, especially when they're in our hemisphere or close to our shores, not necessarily, the other side of the world. Sure. That would have 5,000, maybe 10,000, a brigade, a division, something ready for these scenarios that we're talking about, especially if as Special Agent Myrthil said, that these are no-fail type missions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But I would say that every event is owned by a mayor, owned by a governor, and if it's a foreign country, owned by a president or a prime minister. So number one, you've got to make sure that country is asked. And I know that we can pre-stage and we can be as ready as can be. Probably the best example was Dorian that hit the Bahamas. Mm-hmm. 700 islands in the Bahamas, and they were pummeled. Northern Command, which owns the Bahamas as far as a foreign country, pre-staged helicopters already into Homestead, ready to go. The Coast Guard brought cutters from the south and from the north that were pre-staged as well, and we moved fairly quickly getting in there. But again, part of it is working with the foreign country or working with the governor to find out what are your unmet requirements. Some folks are quicker than others, and candidly, all of our organizations have experts that have been in these events before. The faster sometimes you can parachute somebody in to stand next to that decision maker in a foreign country or a governor to say, these are the type things typically the military can bring, the Coast Guard can bring, the Corps of Engineers has available. The faster you can kind of show the catalog of what's available, the faster you can flow that in.
Yep. Audience members right here in the front. Hold your hand up so she can bring you the microphone. Yes, yeah. Identify yourself, give us your question.
Thank you all for being here today. This is extremely helpful. I'm from the Department of State. I work in crisis management. I echo Hurricane Dorian. I work in the Consular Bureau. And it was, when stuff happens with social media, they're going to you directly, save me, I'm on this coordinate, or they're coming to us, or they're going to the Red Cross. I think the biggest challenge by far is that coordination, collaboration, and avoiding these silos within not only the government, but also trusted partners like the Red Cross, like other foreign partners, knowing the U.S. assets in the air, who's coming, who's going. I think initially there was such a challenge with just, closing the airspace so that you all could get in there and do what you need to do to save lives. So I welcome this conversation. I don't know what we can do to break down those barriers to make it more efficient during a crisis. Thank you.
So I think the question is in the end there of what can you do to break down the barriers that are preventing you to get into where you need to go?
Well, I like to say make a friend before you need a friend. Relationships are key, and that's all the way, even though you're with the federal government, that's all the way down to local and state governance. The Admiral was exactly right. Every event is local. You won't find a federal asset deploy and come forward without that state asking for assistance, whether it's through a presidential disaster declaration or some other authorities that might bring us in there. The other thing is, before you see a large active duty military presence, you will in all likelihood see that state's National Guard be activated by the governor. The state, they want to take care of their own needs, and the federal government is there to provide logistics, support, what have you, but is also postured to bring in the aircraft, the vessels, the logistical support, postured to support the Bahamas for Hurricane Dorian. Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria, that was a very challenging event. Puerto Rico is an island, sounds stupid, but because it is an island, it dramatically made the response to that mission much more complex. And the response to it meant federal partners, we talked daily, we meet every afternoon over in FEMA as an interagency body so that we do fully understand across the board what's going on. But it's a team effort, it's a whole of government.
Well, in a somewhat summarized quick version, what did you learn from Puerto Rico?
That power grid restoration is very difficult. For those of you who don't know, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico lost all its power as a Category 5-4 hurricane struck it and went completely across the island from west to east. Before that storm hit, Puerto Rico's infrastructure was not in good condition. Not everybody had power, but that storm totally took it all out. And it was a very complex mission. It's one that we don't normally do, but FEMA assigned it to us, and we went about that task. Lessons learned, we have some subject matter, that we retain some subject matter expertise on those things that we didn't necessarily know going in that we know now. Biggest thing.
So we're in our last few minutes. I want to give you a chance for your final thoughts. And I usually ask people, or remind panelists in Washington, Congress is right there. They can hear you. There are cameras in the room. This is being recorded. This will live on. And Special Agent, I'll start with you too. And I'll think back to our conversation when you said, again, this is you're in charge of Washington D.C., which is different than these aren't just beaches and beachgoers and civilians. This is a land of high-value targets and terrorist threats. What are you worried about that you need right now?
I think for us, it's kind of piggybacks off of what I said earlier. So it's the known unknowns. So it's individuals that we have data sets for, or threats that we have data sets for that we don't have the context or analysis, data analytics on. So it's the known unknowns is what we call it. I do want to touch on the question here. I think one of the things that we sometimes take for granted, but we do get a lot of value out of, is the value of tabletop exercises and those field training exercises. You shouldn't be meeting your counterparts at a crisis. That's the one thing that we preach with all of our partners here. Is it's easier when you know someone ahead of time and you've discussed those crises, and as well as your tool sets and what you bring to the table as far as resources. So understanding those ahead of time during a crisis, it makes it a lot easier. But again, for us, it's our biggest concern is the threat outpacing our own either technological resources or our personnel resources. Yeah. Talent is a big concern for us as well. We're all competing for the same young mindsets, millennials and individuals with those STEM backgrounds. It's a very stiff competition even amongst us and the Googles of the world and the IT companies that really come in and nurture that talent ahead of time.
Well, I worry about that critical infrastructure that I talked about. It's getting old, and I don't think the nation is prepared to write the check to go build new infrastructure. So how can we continue to get more life out of those without putting communities at risk? I'm concerned about the strain and stress on our people and their ability to deploy. When I went down to Puerto Rico, I'd walk around, I'd shake hands with people. Where are you from? How long you been here? And their response would be, "This is my third tour down here." So, which tour? I worry about our ability to sustain, our ability to respond and deploy, and yet also do our mission here. If Congress is listening, I want to thank you. They've been very good in terms of supplemental dollars to allow us to get at recovering from events and improving infrastructure. But perhaps one of my biggest worries, though, is if you go back to Hurricane Katrina, through Sandy, and these recent events, the supplemental bills are huge, billions and billions and billions of dollars. You have to ask yourself, is that sustainable? And we really need to start focusing more on how do we mitigate risks and gaps that we know exist, and might that not be a better investment of the federal dollar to the left of the boom, the left of the event, than to keep going after it with large supplementals.
Lots of nodding heads in the audience for that one. Admiral, you get the final word.
You bet. And I'm going to finish answer your question. How can we do better? The Coast Guard's motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. And this kind of gets to what Lyonel was talking about, which is ready for what? And I think it requires folks to have an imagination of what could happen. Who is going to be part of that collection of folks that then brings the resources and the knowledge to bear to then effectively respond. We talk about the key events, the Katrinas and the Sandys and all that. But my time up in Alaska, shell drilled in the Arctic. We obviously had a lot of plans in case that went wrong. It went well. We didn't need the plans. That's fine. And Crystal Serenity came up, 1,700 passengers on a cruise liner that went up into the Arctic Ocean. We played forward with industry, with the state, everybody that could be a responder to make sure we were ready and poised to respond if we had to. We didn't have to. But again, just like you said, you don't want to meet people after the bad things happen. Is building those networks, those friends, the partnerships are there, so you know who to call, because all of us are empowered by the cell phone and the numbers you've got in the cell phone and the relationships you've already built.
Well, look, thanks to you all. Again, this is an important conversation, at least for me as an editor of a national security publication, and for us in Washington. Defense One and we're a spinoff of GovExec. NextGov is our sister brand that directly covers federal IT and cyber issues. You might, if you don't know, also want to look into. It's a good example of the non-military parts of our government that are responsible for security. That maybe don't get the attention, definitely don't get the budget that others do, the non-DoD, I should say. Yep. And how important interagency work is, and working together with data is. I do want to make one pitch. Defense One has just launched a new project we're calling the American Readiness Project, which kind of plays into what we're talking here, borrowing a word from the military, meaning there seems to be a big political awakening going on in the country right now. In the last couple of years, everyone's really geeked up about what's going on, and you can know why and you know what's happening. But a lot of those conversations are about domestic issues. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about things like race and immigration and whatever it would be. Not as much about security, especially global security if you're outward looking, but even internal security, like you said, infrastructure, or keeping focus on terrorism as we get farther and farther from 9/11 type events, or every year hurricane response, drug interdiction, whatever it was. That video of the Coast Guard's been pounding on the the top of the submarine. Then he jumped. That's just like that may beat any even FBI drama that's out there right now for what the real life is. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us and for speaking to the audience. Some of them may want to grab you after. I saw a lot of nodding heads. And again, this will be recorded and on our sites for longer posterity to share. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to you.
Thank you.